Aaron Glenn says he does not want a celebrity quarterback on the Jets. Some are interpreting this as a dig at Aaron Rodgers. That's not really clear, but what is clear is Glenn is trying to avoid the mistakes the Jets have made at quarterback in the past. That and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, May 26th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we've got a full slate. We're going to talk about how there might be a unexpected position battle on the offensive line for the Jets in 2025. We're going to talk about how a player who had a breakout 2024 could follow it up with a breakout 2025. But we're going to begin with some comments Aaron Glenn made about the Jets quarterback position last week. Glenn singled out Justin Fields for praise, but in singling out Justin Fields for praise, some are speculating he may have made a little dig at Aaron Rodgers. Glenn was speaking largely about the leadership Fields was providing to the team. He's said many things, but one of the things he said about Justin Fields is there's nothing fake about him. He's just himself, and he's not trying to be a celebrity quarterback. Now, it was a much longer quote, and the context of it was really Glenn going all out to praise Justin Fields. But that celebrity quarterback line drew a lot of attention because of the player the Jets let go this offseason. That, of course, was Aaron Rodgers, who really fits the definition if you're talking about a celebrity quarterback in the NFL. Rodgers, one of the most famous players in the league, a guy who's a constant presence in the media, a guy who is a constant source of controversy. So when you make the comment, Justin Fields, in praising him, is not a celebrity quarterback, people are going to draw the insinuation that maybe you're taking a little dig at the guy you let go, who is a celebrity quarterback. And like nobody can really get into Aaron Glenn's mind to know whether he was really talking about Aaron Rodgers or whether he was trying to insult Aaron Rodgers. My guess, based on the context of the quote, was that he was not trying to insult Aaron Rodgers. But I do get the feeling this is Glenn's mindset. And I get the feeling that played into the decision the Jets made to let Aaron Rodgers go this offseason. Because you're seeing it play out now with the Pittsburgh Steelers, where Rodgers has essentially turned the offseason into a soap opera. Is he going to play next year? Is he not? If Rodgers was around here, I don't know if it would be the exact same sort of soap opera. I mean, I think the Jets would have asked him to commit early, but wherever Aaron Rodgers is, it's always going to be about Aaron Rodgers. And thinking about this in a deeper context, I think Aaron Glenn, in some ways, with the way he's handling the quarterback position, is perhaps preventing the Jets from making some of the same mistakes they've made in the past. Because as important as the quarterback position is in the NFL, and it is very important, make no mistake about it, it's the most important position on the field. If you don't have a quarterback who can play effectively, you can't win in this league. I think that in many ways, the Jets over the last 15 years or so have maybe overemphasized the quarterback. And perhaps that's not the right way of putting it. Perhaps the right way of putting it is that they focused exclusively on the quarterback. When the quarterback is an essential part of winning, it's not the only part of winning, though. And, we saw that the last 2 years, how much the Jets built around Aaron Rodgers, thinking that all we needed was Rodgers to win. It didn't matter if we had Robert Saleh here. It didn't matter if we had Nathaniel Hackett calling the plays. It didn't matter if we didn't sign a receiver better than Allen Lazard in 2023. The Jets felt like a quarterback could fix all of their problems. But if you go back further, that's also been the case with some of the young quarterbacks the Jets have drafted. It was the case with Zach Wilson. It was the case with Sam Darnold, where the Jets put these young quarterbacks, particularly Darnold more than Wilson, but the Jets put these young quarterbacks, just threw them into the mix, and they struggled right off the bat. And you could hear it when the Jets spoke. When the Jets had Darnold, they did really dumb things. Like they hired Adam Gase as their coach, and they made awful personnel moves. They did not build a good offensive line. And the thing you heard over and over is, well, we have Sam Darnold. He'll figure it out. I think this was true to a lesser extent with Zach Wilson because I think the Jets did a better job building the team around Zach, and a lot of Zach's failures were just on Zach. But even then, they took this kid who really wasn't ready to play and essentially asked him to be the guy right off the bat when he was a kid who really needed to sit for multiple years. Now, there's being a celebrity quarterback, and then there's viewing your quarterback through the lens that he has to be the one and only guy. And I think that the Jets have done that frequently. I think the Jets have frequently just expected too much out of the quarterback. They've expected the quarterback to be able to handle every single thing they throw at them. They've expected the quarterback to be able to bail the franchise out when they make bad decisions. They've expected the quarterback to rise to the occasion when he didn't have the right pieces around him. Or in the case of Rodgers, they just felt like that the quarterback was all that they needed. And if the Jets are going to be successful, I think that's something that's got to change. Now, of course, at some point in Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji's tenure, they're going to draft a quarterback, unless Justin Fields surprises us all. But in any event, the Jets will want a high profile quarterback because you become a high profile quarterback by being good. And the easiest path to winning big in the NFL is by getting a top notch quarterback. So this will have to happen at some point. But I think when Aaron Glenn's coming in and what he's instilling is they want to build up the rest of the team first. And you can't always choose the best time to draft the quarterback because there are a limited supply of quarterbacks. You don't get the opportunity to draft a good one every single year. That's just not how it works. But the other thing I'd say is obviously if you draft the right quarterback at the right time, a guy who's like the exception to the rule, the guy who's ready to play right off the bat, the Joe Burrows of the world, the Justin Herberts of the world, the CJ Strouds of the world, they can make an outsized impact on your franchise moving forward. But those guys are kind of the exception. A lot of quarterbacks need to be brought along slowly. A lot of quarterbacks need the right pieces around them in order to have success. And while the Jets eventually will want a celebrity quarterback, and I think, in many ways, Glenn was just talking about the way a player interacts with his teammates, but the Jets will want a guy who's a high profile quarterback because the high profile quarterbacks tend to be the best quarterbacks, and they tend to be the guys who make it easiest to win. And the Jets certainly want Justin Fields to play well. The focus right now for the team is not around the quarterback. And it's not going to be all, and I think that this will impact the team in a way that it's not going to all be on Justin Fields this year. For the first time in quite a while, the Jets aren't putting all the weight of the world on the quarterback's shoulders. The Jets want the other pieces. The Jets want to build a full team around Justin Fields. And I think that that's something that's been lacking around this team. It's always a balance. I'm not suggesting the quarterback's unimportant. Of course, the quarterback's the most important player you've got in the NFL. But if it's possible to overestimate what a quarterback can accomplish, and if it's possible to just put too much on the plate of a quarterback, I think that's something the Jets have done over and over and over again during this losing stretch for the franchise. And as we all know, and as one thing I want to preach is that we can't guarantee Aaron Glenn's going to be successful as head coach of the New York Jets. We certainly can hope for it. We certainly can root for him. Nobody knows for sure whether or not the plan's going to work because we've had Jets, new coaches, new GMs come in before, and that first year they have a plan, and you say, you know what, that plan makes sense. It's always about how you implement the plan. And that's as important as having a good plan. But I think that the plan for the Jets to not focus everything on the quarterback for where the franchise is right now and for the mistakes the franchise has made in the past, it seems like a pretty solid one to me. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball. Will McDonald, this was a guy who had a breakout season in 2024. Normally, you don't follow a breakout season with another breakout season. Usually, if you rise to play at a star level, you can't get much better. But there's news that came out recently that suggests Will McDonald has a shot of breaking out again in 2025. I'll explain how that can be as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Skylight Calendar. Say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbled plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites. The Skylight Calendar is here to bring clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. This sleek digital display syncs your existing calendars, Google, Apple, Outlook, and more, making it simple to track appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy-to-see place. What would it mean to eliminate the I don't know excuse from your family's routine? Could assigning everyone their own color finally solve the who does what confusion in your house? How often do plans get missed because they're buried in a digital calendar or not written down at all? And if you're a Jets player, make sure you get to practice on time. That'd be a good thing with a new head coach. Well, Skylight Calendar is here to help you fix that problem. And right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to skylightcal.com/NFL. Go to skylightcal.com/NFL for $30 off your 15-inch calendar. That's skylightcal.com/NFL. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Aaron Glenn said something interesting to the media late last week that did not deal with Justin Fields or Aaron Rodgers. We spent our first segment discussing the saga of Glenn's comments about how he doesn't want a celebrity quarterback and getting off Aaron Rodgers, focusing on what it actually means for the team. But Glenn also indicated that Will McDonald, who had a breakout season in 2025, 10 and a half sacks, a really productive second season for the Iowa State product, has added about 15 pounds of bulk this offseason. And I heard that. And I was happy to hear that. And part of the reason I was happy to hear that is this is what was supposed to happen a year ago with Will McDonald. Heading into the offseason after the 2023 season, Robert Saleh suggested that Will McDonald was going to bulk up for 2024 for year two. And then McDonald got to training camp and Saleh said, no, we canceled that. It was the same, he was staying at the same size. And it was kind of confusing because McDonald entered 2024 as one of the smallest defensive linemen in the NFL. At the point he was drafted, he was only 236 pounds. And there's actually a website that keeps track of player measurables. That put Will McDonald in the second, that's number two, the second percentile for weight at the edge rusher position among all prospects who have been drafted in the last 30 years or so. So it means like 98% of prospects weighed more than Will McDonald at the defensive end position over the last 30 years or so. And that was puzzling because he was in the 46th percentile for height, so about an average height, and the 79th percentile for wingspan. So, a wingspan that's larger than 78% of other defensive end prospects. Why is that important? Well, that's a sign like you can add muscle and not lose your athleticism. And for McDonald, a guy who's really small, I mean, one of the smallest defensive linemen in the NFL, he had the ability to add some bulk and not have it like take away from his speed and athleticism. That's important because, of course, if you follow McDonald, the guy really relies on that speed rush, just the ability to explode out of his snap to get past guys. It wasn't going to impact him. Sometimes you see a guy bulk up and it really kind of slows him down. If you go back a couple of years, Elijah Moore, really undersized receiver. He entered year two bulked up. And I remember thinking that could be trouble because he was a small guy. He didn't really have much of a frame to add muscle. And if he added muscle, he was going to slow down. And I thought Elijah Moore played much slower his second season than he did his first year. Go back even further. I remember there was one year with Dustin Keller, the Jets tight end, in the Mark Sanchez era. And they talk all the talk about how he added bulk. I'm like, that's trouble. Because again, Keller was a guy who was probably maxed out where he was. Well, McDonald was, at 235 for his height, for his wingspan, he could add plenty of muscle. And the lack of muscle did not really impact him as a pass rusher last year. He had a very productive season, 10 and a half sacks, a good pressure rate, showed that he can rush the passer in this league. But where it impacted McDonald negatively is he was a liability in the run game. In fact, and I like Will McDonald, but I think it's fair to say he was borderline unplayable against the run. And, you look at last year, he played about 2 out of every 3 snaps. That was not sustainable. And if you look at the reason the Jets had issues against the run last year, there were no easy explanations. I mean, Javon Kinlaw's play, we could probably spend the whole show talking about Javon Kinlaw's play against the run last year. We want to talk about why the Jets were bad against the run. But one of the issues the Jets had was they just didn't really have many good pass rushers. So one of the few good pass rushers they had was McDonald. He had to be on the field longer than you wanted him to be. He had to be on the field more than you wanted him to be because he was the only guy that could get to the quarterback. But when you put a guy who's like 235 pounds on the field that long, he's gonna get eaten alive in the run game. And that's kind of what happened to McDonald through much of the season. But it all just felt really needless because, again, this is a guy who, by all accounts, has the build to be an effective to add bulk. And if you add bulk, he'll be able to hold up against the run better. So it creates a very interesting dynamic for the New York Jets because Will McDonald had a breakout season in 2024. Again, he went from being kind of an afterthought, a guy who was actually a healthy scratch a couple of times as a rookie, a guy who was generating some concern as a rookie because of how little he was getting on the field, to a double-digit sack guy in year two. So that was a big step forward. But he was one of the worst run defenders in the league at the defensive end position. Again, I'd argue needlessly. I don't know why they couldn't have had him at bulk last year. But now there's a real opportunity for Will McDonald. There's an opportunity to improve. There's an opportunity for him to even have an even better year three than year two because a guy like Will McDonald who gets to the quarterback at the rate he does, a guy like Will McDonald who has double-digit sacks, he doesn't need to be like a shutdown run defender to justify a lot of playing time. He doesn't need to be a shutdown run defender in order to just stay on the field on early downs and not be a liability. He's the type of guy where if he's even like an adequate run defender, if he's okay at setting the edge, then you can play him, you can play him longer. Heading into the offseason, I saw his snap total again, about 2 out of 3 snaps last year that he played. And I felt like that number needed to go down if he was going to play at his 2024 weight because you saw him really struggle against in the run game. You saw him really struggle at setting the edge. And it looked like, if he wasn't going to bulk up, he was going to need to be a pass rushing specialist. He was going to need to be, a designated pass rusher, a guy who never sees the field on early downs, only plays on downs where the other team's obviously throwing. Now, in today's NFL, that's not a guy who's limited to third down. 20, 30 years ago, a guy who was a pass rushing specialist, he'd maybe play like get one snap a series. You bring him in for third and longs, and that would be it. In today's NFL, it's a little different. In today's NFL, a pass rushing specialist can get like 50% of the snaps without being a liability because if you get if you hold the opponent to 2 yards or less on first down, second down becomes an obvious passing down. So it's very unlikely the other team's going to run the ball in that situation. So you can run your designated pass rusher on the field, and you won't really have a problem with that. But it still would have limited McDonald's ability to be on the field frequently. And now you've got an opportunity. And the other aspect of this is that it's very difficult to be a consistent 10 sack guy if you're not on the field on the early downs because you're limiting your snap totals. If you're only limited to like half the snaps, you're probably not going to get as many opportunities to get sacks. If McDonald can hold up in the run game, if he can just be adequate, he can just do a solid job, it changes everything for this team. It changes everything for Will McDonald. This could be the type of guy who is a consistent double-digit sack guy, and a guy who could justify the pick. I mean, we all remember in 2023, I think I was about the only person who defended this pick in 2023. Now, that doesn't mean I'm always right, but this was one that people were very against this pick. And it was because the Jets didn't really have a big needed defensive end at the time. And I remember thinking this guy's got a shot to be a good player. And at this point, it looks like he's justifying the pick because again, double-digit sacks in year two, but a guy who was a one-dimensional player. And you'd like to see a guy like this continue to grow. Usually, as I frequently say, if you're an everyday or you hear this a lot, I say that the biggest improvement a player makes is between year one and year two. And that's just, getting your feet wet in the NFL. You're used to the competition. You're used to the playbook. You're used to being a pro after your first season. But this is a real opportunity for McDonald because this is a guy who's kind of changing his physique. He's kind of changing his body right now. And that means that there's an opportunity to grow between year two and year three because he's kind of trying to turn himself into a different type of player that usually isn't there. And the guy between year one and year two made a big leap because he turned into a very good pass rusher. Now, if McDonald can just get himself to a point where he can be solid against the run, I mean, he could be a tremendous player and an even more tremendous asset for the Jets moving forward. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another player the Jets drafted in 2023. The first round pick was Will McDonald. The second round pick was Joe Tippmann. The assumption has been that Joe Tippmann's going to be the starting center going forward. Well, according to one report, not so fast. I still think Tippmann's going to keep the job, but there could be a center controversy that I'll explain as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We've just spent some time talking about the Jets' first round pick in 2023, Will McDonald, about how he may be bulking up, and that could give him an opportunity to get even better, improve after what was a breakout season in 2024. Well, there's news that's not quite as positive about the Jets' second round pick in 2023, and that's Joe Tippmann, who also had a very good 2024 season. He did a good job as the Jets starting center. Tippmann was drafted in the second round in 2023, began his rookie season as a backup, then saw some time at guard because of the injuries the Jets suffered on the offensive line. Eventually slid inside to center after Connor McGovern got injured, took over the starting center job in 2024, and showed that he can play in the league. I think there's no question going forward that Joe Tippmann can be a starting center in the league, and I think most of us assume that he would just keep the job going forward. Well, according to Zach Rosenblatt of The Athletic, who, does break quite a bit of news, it's not such a given. Rosenblatt wrote late last week there could be legitimate competition at center between Joe Tippmann and free agent signee Josh Myers, something general manager Darren Muji alluded to at the league meeting in March. Those guys are battling right now, just competing. They're both super intelligent and just fighting their warriors. And that last part was a quote from John Simpson. So I don't know whether Rosenblatt was speculating or whether that's actually insider information, but it is worth noting because I think most of us assume that Tippmann had the center job locked down, even with the signing of Josh Myers, who was a 3-year starter with the Green Bay Packers. Ironic the Jets bring in Josh Myers as they get rid of the former Green Bay quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who Myers actually snapped to for a brief period. Um, this is kind of how I view it. I think that teams are not inclined enough to make their guys compete, continue to force their guys to be uncomfortable to justify their start in the starting lineup. I don't have any problem with competition. I think it's good. I think that the NFL, we're talking about starting players, things should not be given to you. You should be forced to you should earn them and you should continue to earn them. The team should put you in a position where you continue to have to earn your keep. You continue to have to earn your job. And this is the type of thing you see frequently in a new regime. Even a guy who would have been a guaranteed starter under the old regime, a guy like Joe Tippmann, now has to earn his starting job. He hasn't proven anything to the new coaching staff and GM. And part of this to me is going to be a test of Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci going forward. Will they treat the guys they bring in the same way they're treating Joe Tippmann right now? Because very easy to do this to somebody else's draft pick. Very easy to take a guy who's a presumed starter who somebody else acquired, who Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh acquired, and force him to earn his keep. Will Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci be willing to do the same thing to their own guys who are established starters? Because you may remember when Joe Douglas took over as Jets GM, it was a very odd time of the calendar. The Jets fired Mike McCagnon in May, hired Joe Douglas after the draft, and Joe Douglas cut in his first training camp Ja'Kai Polite, who was a third round pick that year. You don't see a third round pick get cut in his rookie training camp all that much, but part of it was that the GM who drafted him was gone. It was just a few months later, but the GM who drafted him was gone. Joe Douglas never treated his own picks like that, even guys who really kind of struggled, guys who maybe shouldn't have made the team. So I do think there's a question. It's very easy to embrace competition when it's a guy somebody else brought in. That's something I hope to see going forward with Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci. And it's good. I still think competition is a good thing. I'm not going to complain at all about Joe Tippmann being forced to compete for a starting job. And part of this is that Josh Myers is not that great. I think Josh Myers was a good signing from the standpoint that he's a guy with multiple years of starting experience. He's a guy who's not been a disaster when he's been starting. These are positive things. And I think we're talking about backups, especially on the offensive line. What I'm looking for more than anything is don't be a disaster. Because nobody really has good backups on the offensive line. It's just a question of, will you actively hurt the offensive line if you're in there? I think for Josh Myers, the answer is no. He's not going to be an impact player. And this is the type of guy Joe Tippmann should have no issue beating out because Joe Tippmann's got more upside. And Joe Tippmann did a very good job last year as center, in my opinion. And not only that, he's just, more physically gifted, a big guy, a strong guy. When he locks onto a defender, he can move him. And he's also mobile. And I think that Joe Tippmann's mobility adds things to the playbook because you can pull him. And there aren't that many centers in the NFL you can pull effectively. It adds, new wrinkles. It adds new plays to the playbook. It forces defenders to be a little bit more uncomfortable because you don't know which angle you're going to be hit from a defender. A guy, a linebacker on the second level on the play side may not be used to having to keep his eye out for the center. But with Joe Tippmann around and Joe Tippmann's mobility, suddenly you have to. There really should be no issue with Joe Tippmann beating out Josh Myers. And that's ultimately where it comes down. I think if Josh Myers beats Joe Tippmann out for the job, it means one of two things. It either means the coaching staff has made a bad decision, or it means Joe Tippmann, something's happened with him and he's regressed. because there really is no excuse for Joe Tippmann to not win this job. Joe Tippmann should be the Jets starting center for the next, I'd say, 6 to 8 years. There's really outside of outside of if he's unlucky with injury, there's very little that should prevent him from having a very successful career with this team, from being a very good starting center going forward, because he's a guy with all the ability in the world and the guy who's shown he can play in the NFL. When the Jets drafted him, I wasn't entirely sure where Tippmann was going to end up. There was a school of thought that maybe he'd be better off a guard. There was even a school of thought that, he never played tackle before, but this is a guy with like all the physical tools you'd want from a tackle. There was a thought maybe they move him out there. But his position that's in college was center. That's where, he was most comfortable. That's where he played almost all his college career, and it's his natural position. And I think any question about where Joe Tippmann belongs went out the window last year. Even heading into last year, I could have understood the argument maybe he was better off at guard, because I actually thought there was an argument to be made based on his play at guard in 2023 as a rookie. But now that he's found a good position, and I say the same thing with Elijah Vera Tucker, who bounced around and it wasn't really clear what AVT's natural position was. Now that you found a position where this guy's had success in, don't mess around with it. Don't overthink it. Leave him there. And I think Joe Tippmann, there may be a center competition. I don't think that there's a huge debate about who should win that competition, though. Joe Tippmann's a much better player than Josh Myers. No offense to Josh Myers, who I think is a solid backup and who I think, could even be a starting center in this league. But there's no real question who should win that competition. It's Joe Tippmann by a mile. And if Joe Tippmann doesn't win it, then we've got bigger questions. But I don't have any problem with Joe Tippmann being forced to earn his starting job. I think players should have to earn their keep every single year. I think getting into a mindset where players need to prove themselves every single day, that's not a bad thing. That's how you create a culture of accountability. And that's how you avoid players having celebrity mindsets, as we discussed in the first segment. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.